Well, I still feel new enough in Belleville that I can congratulate you for 62 years on the 62nd anniversary of Eastminster United. And from what I have been told, Eastminster has had a great ride for 62 years. Under just 4 pastors, lead pastors until now, it's had an incredible amount of lay involvement, many wonderful ministries, and a strong role within the broader community. Yet, as I begin my ministry here, I wonder if the church has reached a critical point in the journey. And I said this once before, but on any given Sunday, we can look around the room and see that we're not really attracting younger families and young children and youth to our worship time. And from time to time, even in the dozen or so weeks that I've been here, I've heard some people lamenting about this and questioning what are we going to do about it. Eastminster isn't alone in this predicament. Many mainline churches are struggling with relevancy for this current age. And there are quite a number who have reached a point that they're even struggling to stay alive as churches. Over the past 10 days or so, I've had 2 discussions with people who were lamenting what was going on in their congregations and their churches. And both could look back to days when their church was strong and was packed with people from all age groups. And one said to me, growing up in that environment, we felt that it would always be. But I guess if things like the Berlin Wall can fall, even a church can fall. And so he went on with heaviness of heart and talked about his church perhaps closing its doors. Another man looked back to the day when his church had over 1,200 members in the late 60s or early 70s. And he said, now we have 26. And he said, we can't afford to keep the building. I love this place. Our roof needs fixed. We can't afford it. And these types of stories I've heard repeatedly over and again within church circles, and many people are longing for a simpler, better times. They're looking back and wishing that things were as they were. And it sounds a little bit to me like the people of ancient Judah that were talking to the psalmist and saying, oh, that we might see some good. As the psalmist penned that psalm, the people were looking back to a time when they were happy, when their grain and their wine abounded. Their fortunes had changed, however. Things weren't as good. They were hurting. They're struggling to make ends meet. And they're looking for someone to blame. And that someone was the psalmist, whom the Old Testament scholar Arthur Weiser says was probably a priest. And they're blaming him and they're blaming God, and the psalmist felt the injustice of all the accusations that were coming to him. And he notes that these people themselves, they had turned away from God, and yet they want God's blessing. And they're complaining and they're saying, oh, that we might see some good. Oh, that we might see some good. And as I thought about that, as we are looking forward to another ministry, I wondered if we could learn, first of all, from people who have been through some difficult times or been disheartened or whatever, and use those not just to sort of sit in them, but use them to reach new heights of success. And I think, for instance, of Victor Hugo. During his days, his early years, he enjoyed tremendous success. His biographer said that he was the pet of the populace, the pride of the theater, the glory of Paris. And then Napoleon rose to power, and there was a growing tyranny within things, and Hugo was against it. And the problem is, when you move and write against people in power, there are risks to that. And that meant for Hugo an edict of banishment and exile for almost 19 years. And his biographer says that his life became a shadow of its former self. He was having a deplorable sort of existence. But yet, he said, out of those years came his greatest works, his greatest writings. He became miraculously inspired. His books were far stronger than anything that had gone before, and he became twice the man he was before. And even Hugo himself exclaimed, "Why was I not exiled before?" And so, whereas many people would sit around in times like that and say, "Who will show us any good?" Hugo seemed to use that to accomplish things that were great. I can think of Martin Luther as well. Martin Luther, early 16th century. He's a faithful man in the midst of a church that was erring. And the church had fallen problems to maybe those associated with power and wealth, and it had fallen ill. And it was leading people astray. It was preaching, for instance, that salvation could be gained by just contributing to the great building schemes in Rome. Just send in your money and heaven awaits. Doesn't matter what you do. Doesn't matter if you faith. Doesn't matter if you live appropriately. You're going to heaven. And Luther was sort of appalled at this, and the problem was taking on the church hierarchy. That too was a dangerous road to go. And in those days, many had tried and faced the Inquisition, and they had lost. And so it was a difficult time. But 500 years ago, this year, Martin Luther took stock. He named the abuses, and he put 95 theses, they were called, on the door of the Wittenberg church. And while other people were sitting around saying, "Who will show us any good?" Luther stood up. And what happened was a difficult chapter in the life of the church turned into a great chapter as the winds of Reformation blew right across Europe. So what I'd like to suggest to you today is that, challenging as these days may be for perhaps this church to get young families into it, young people, or the mainline church to live successfully and grow, we're at a time when we can make choices. We can sit around and complain and say, "Oh, that we would see some good," and look back to yesteryear, or we can begin to do something, and do something significant and something great. And here at Eastminster, I would encourage us, while this church is still strong, to begin to think about these things and say, well, can we maybe cast off some of the shackles of another day and become stronger than we've ever been? Now think about the business world. If a business is beginning to fail, they don't just sit around and do nothing and think about the old days, because that will sure make the business fail. They change things, and if the management don't change things, the shareholders will certainly rise up and force their hand to protect shareholder value, make the business successful again. And so a business, if it's going to survive, will do things. What about the church? Maybe for too long we have relied on the past and relied on the types of things that went on in the past. And that was great work. In many congregations, it was great work. And they did good things in their day and appealed to that culture and that day. But we have to all admit that the culture and the day has changed. And maybe what worked and what was important in the 19th and 20th centuries are not as important and aren't working as well today. And so we have to start asking some big questions. We can ask big denominational questions, like, what about denominationalism? In the past we had Roman Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox. And then within the Protestant movement, you'd have United and Presbyterian and Anglican and Baptist and Pentecostal and Mennonite and Brethren and all sorts of others. And things were going so well that they could put churches on four corners sometimes, and each church would be successful. But these days, those four churches might be struggling. And sometimes we need to realize, as church, that our issues are not really with the Baptists, but the issue, perhaps for the church, is with those who exclude God, a worldview that excludes God. And we have to ask, what are we going to do about it? And maybe denominationalism, people are saying, is a thing of the past, that we don't have that luxury anymore. We need to, at the very least, start working together. And I'm glad I've seen that a little bit in Belleville with this, with the refugee support, as churches are getting together and working together to support others. Another sort of big question, what about ministry? In the past, the church had a model of ministry where the clergy were supposed to do the work of ministry. And laity were sort of ministered to and were more passive. And in the United Church, we've had come a long way in that regard. And from what I've seen so far, Eastminster is like a model church because we have so much lay involvement in ministry. But we have to keep asking that question. Who does the work of ministry and what does it entail? Now I'm going to get to an even bigger question. What about worship style? Are traditional models of worship working? Not that we need to let go, so I want those who like the traditional worship to relax. Not that we need to let go of traditional worship forms that are much cherished, but do we need to provide other forms that will allow other people from another generation to glorify God, but in a different way? And what will that look like? And what will it mean for the church? I keep asking myself why it is that evangelical churches seem to attract people, and why young people go there. Do we need to learn from them and take some of what they're doing and mix it with some of what we're doing and hopefully address a new generation? What are we going to do? Worship in the future may be more multiform than we have had in the past. And then another question, another big one, what about outreach and mission? This may be a great time for the church to become relevant again. And in being relevant, we need to take stock of the fact that we are in a different world these days. It's a world that's postmodern. Our whole country has and is becoming more multi-ethnic and multicultural and multi-faith and postmodern, complex. And the assumptions and the notions that worked in a predominantly Christian nation 100 years ago don't work as well today. I don't have to go back 100 years, because I can't, but if I go back to when I was younger, there was a notion in some churches, say an evangelical church, that you could walk up to some kid and just say, you need to be saved. And they had at least some understanding of what that meant. But can you imagine walking up to a kid today who's wearing headphones, a hoodie, and he's bouncing a basketball and saying, you need to be saved? Not going to work. Or coming from a liberal church perspective. That our church has basically thought if you do good in the world and benefit others, then you're going to benefit the church. But today, people will take acts of kindness, they'll say thank you, and they'll carry on. So we live in this new environment, and it's completely lacking a Christian context. They don't understand our acts of service. They don't understand our talk of Jesus. And most people today don't have half a dozen years of religious education in school when the minister would maybe pop into the local school and teach people. They don't go to church regularly or at all. And so they don't know what God's about. This is a very different world, and the church needs to gear up for that. Go out without any assumptions whatsoever. Talk about God without the jargon, and just tell the story of Jesus. It needs us to sort of step up and to have the freedom to talk about it with our friends, with our neighbors, with our children, with our grandchildren. We need to get out into the highways and byways of life. We need to get out into pubs and restaurants and the arenas. And from time to time, when the opportunity arises, talk about it. We need to get out there because a lot of people aren't in here. And so we can sit around and we can say, who will show us any good? Or we can get outside our shell, recover our mission, speak to a new generation. It's a tall order. It's not easy. But what seems difficult and what seems challenging may turn out to be a really great time to live and to move things forward and see the church grow again. Here we are celebrating 62 years in a church that's still strong and a church that's still active. But yet, I think, and this is just my early observation, this might be a critical time. Critical time when we need to do things, change things. But if we're going to do that, there's one other part of this psalm that's really, really important. The psalmist, when he speaks, he's speaking out of a holistic faith, a faith that honors God in all ways. It honors God in how we think and how we talk and how we walk. And according to the psalmist, it's when those things all come together, that's when the blessing of God starts to occur. You know, we could work and work and work and work and do church things all we like. But if we want to navigate the waters of this age, we need to do it with God at the center. And if God is the captain, then things are going to start to fall into place. And the church will come along and grow. And that's as true of our lives in general as it is of the corporate body we know as the church. When God's at the center, it's then that things really begin to happen. I like a song. Problem with songs, if I start reading the words, I want to start singing them. But there's a song that Garth Brooks did a number of years ago called The River. It goes like this, you know, a dream is like a river, ever changing as it flows. And a dreamer is just a vessel that must follow where it goes. Trying to learn from what's behind you and never knowing what's in store makes each day a constant battle just to stay between the shores. And then there's the chorus. It comes back with a bridge, and there's bound to be rough waters, and I know I'll take some falls, but with the good Lord as my captain, I can make it through them all. And I will sail my vessel. It keeps going. Until the river runs high. Let us pray.